So last time we talked a little bit about stories and the connections of stories and faith, and specifically our stories around race and racism. And so what we're going to do this week is rethink how we read the Bible. And so we're going to do that by trying out a couple of methods that let us read the Bible through lenses of race, gender, and empire. And if you went to seminary back when I did, or earlier, in the 70s and 80s, you probably didn't do a lot of this stuff. This is stuff I had to figure out on my own. If you've, been at one of the cooperative Baptist seminaries in the last few years, you might have done some of this. And so we're going to dig in and learn how to do a couple of these methods, because I think they're especially helpful as we think about how to do anti-racist work in the church. But first, I want to start off and look at some of the feminist critiques of traditional biblical interpretation, because my guess is most of us sort of grew up with, a method that may have been scholarly and drawn on the best of historical critical scholarship, who were looking at the author and the context and the audience, without realizing that that was actually a very gendered process. And so feminist, womanist, other minoritized scholars have really challenged historical criticism itself. And so we use it as a tool, but we also go beyond it. And so that's what we're going to do a little bit here, looking specifically at how certain groups of color have done this as sort of helpful tools to move us to the next level of doing biblical interpretation to support anti-racist work. So what are the critiques? First of all, it's like, who has done biblical interpretation? And traditionally, it's been cisgender, heterosexual, white men. And interpretation isn't a neutral process. Who we are shapes how we read the text. And so who does interpretation matters. And so it's rooted in the experiences of the people who've been doing the interpretations. And so that's the lens we've had on it. And when we do these next couple of methods, you'll see what that means, because you'll see what it means to look at these biblical passages through different lenses. Traditional interpretation also has relied on these false binaries of men, women, of color, white, straight, queer, and then it sort of assumes as the norm those experiences that are male, white, straight, and so on. And so things that are not those get framed as somehow being aberrant or problematic or sinful. And so looking through other lenses helps us balance that out. It has often downplayed things that are in the text. Even people who claim to read it literally have done this, and they've downplayed female and feminine imagery in the biblical text and have ignored women's significance in the text. For example, I saw something the other day that it just cracked me up on Twitter, where somebody was talking about all the conversation now about sort of biblical womanhood and marriage, and they wanted to know why it was always Proverbs 31 and not, Jael driving a tent peg through Sisera's head. So, what we select as biblical womanhood, depends on who we are and what our points of view are. Traditional interpretation has served to maintain power in the hands of people who are this norm. And so it has not been equally liberatory for all people. And so it has actually helped straight, white, cis men stay in power over minoritized groups. And I use minoritized because we know women are actually a greater percentage of the population, but minoritized is a term that comes out of sort of social science studies that recognizes that while women may have greater numbers, they don't have social power in the same way. And so they're minoritized by virtue of the lack of social power. Traditional interpretation has also ignored the impact of empire on the biblical text. We're going to talk a little bit more in a bit about post-colonial interpretation. That stuff blew my mind, because I was years into my teaching career before I ran across post-colonial feminist biblical criticism. And we have a text that was written in empire, at times supporting empire, at times challenging empire, with a Jesus who lived under empire, who was crucified by that empire. And yet I had never had anyone suggest to me that we had to pay attention to the role of empire. So this stuff it's mind-blowing. And at the end, I'm going to give you some resources to do some further reading if this stuff interests you, because there's a lot to it. And I'm just going to try to sort of pique your interest a little bit. Traditional interpretation has also ignored the perspectives of multiply marginalized people. So what that means is it has ignored intersectionality. And so even when we've talked about women or we've talked about people of color, we haven't brought that together so that we've talked about, say, queer women of color as a group within the framework of biblical interpretation. And it also has ignored the ways power is deployed in biblical text. So much in the same way we aren't taught to think about empire, we're not taught to think about social, economic, political power in the text. And that's ways both that power works in the text itself and the ways people use the text to gain and maintain power. It's also reinforced anti-Semitic biases in Christian interpretation, and we really have to watch out for that in the ways, for example, that we talk about Pharisees and Sadducees. We can be really anti-Semitic without intending to be, but our intentions don't negate the harm that we do when we sort of give into sort of Jew blaming. And I think that's really important at this moment. I don't know if you all have seen all of the overt anti-Semitism that's out there right now. I mean, you have Kanye West with the stuff he's saying. You've had, some leaders in other religious groups, politicians. And so we want to be really careful that we don't reinforce those biases by the ways that we interpret the Bible. In its place, what I want to propose is contextual interpretation. And the two methods we're going to try are forms of contextual interpretation. And so interpretation is always done within a specific cultural and historical context. And so the way that we interpret the text as 21st century Americans who are probably predominantly white in this group, I would guess, who, are probably predominantly straight with maybe a few queer folk, that matters. That probably a lot of you are in the South. And being from Georgia, I would say in the South and in Texas, because that's going to affect how you read it. What we talk about as a social location, where you are and who you are, matters. And so each culture brings something different to the text. And you'll really see this as we go along. And in a little bit, we look at some African interpretation, and you'll see it reads in a very different way when you're sitting in a different place. We need to interpret our own culture, engage in cultural dialogue, and work toward cultural transformation. So we don't read the Bible as simply something out there, but rather we read the Bible as something within this culture, and our culture interprets the Bible, and then the Bible interprets our culture. And so there's an ongoing dialogue between those. And we have to have dialogue across cultures. And especially the second activity we're going to do really ask you to look at a biblical story from multiple perspectives, which have competing interpretations and which I would argue are all equally valid. So it's complicated to do this kind of work. And we must pay attention to the plurality of cultures and the dynamics of particular cultures. And so we have to recognize that there's going to be all of this difference. And so reading the Bible isn't about coming up with the one right interpretation. There is no one right interpretation. If that's what we're after, we've already missed the mark. I mean, people in the time when the Bible was written wouldn't even have understood that impulse in us. That's not how they understood text. In fact, I mean, mostly they were illiterate. I mean, that they were doing oral tradition. And so the ways that we go about interpreting, trying to find what's the right meaning would be very, very foreign to them. And we must examine the myths and ideologies that keep oppressive cultural practices in place. And so we have to recognize that while we value culture and different cultures, that there can be things in cultures that are problematic, and we have to call that out. Now, the best place for that to happen is from within that culture, so that that it's not my place to critique people who live in Botswana. It's my place to support the feminists within Botswana culture that critique whatever goes on there. My role is to critique what I see here in our culture, where I'm a part of it, but also to learn from and bring into dialogue what I learned from those cultures. And interpretation grows out of the actual experiences of human beings in their historical, social, and cultural context. So again, that just reiterates that who is doing the interpreting matters. And that's actually a really good thing, because how I read the Bible and how Paula reads it and how Ken reads it is going to be different given our different context and our different histories. But there's a piece of what Ken and Paula know that I don't have access to, because I don't have those experiences. And so when I listen to them, I learn something, even if we're coming up with different interpretations, because they're still valid coming from our social locations. And so we need all the voices, because we don't have those pieces. And so that's going to be really important now as we move along and talk about what this means for anti-racism work, because so often in predominantly white congregations, we don't have those conversations, and we don't hear the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so we keep interpreting out of our frameworks as if they're the frameworks that fit for everybody, as if somehow our interpretation is objective, it's without a history, it's without a social context. And we need to hear those voices to challenge us as well. So we're going to look at two examples of how we do this with the Bible, and I'm going to let you do most of the work. I'm going to give you a little information and then send you off into your groups to really dig into these stories. So the first example comes from womanist interpretation. And womanist comes from, it's a phrase from Alice Walker. And womanist interpretation is about Black women and the centering of Black women's experiences. And then after that, we'll talk about post-colonial feminist interpretation. And this is about sort of looking at that intersection of empire and gender and getting really complicated with the intersections. So before you go into groups to do this, let me tell you just a little bit about womanist interpretation. So it's rooted in Black women's experiences, and that's where it starts. So this is a little different. Contextual interpretation doesn't start with the text and move to experience, but rather it starts with experience and moves to the text. So it reads the text from the experience of the person who's doing the reading. It's committed to Black women's surviving and thriving. So it's not a neutral reading that is true for all people in all times and all places, but rather it is a reading that specific purpose is the liberation of Black women from racist and sexist, that intersection of oppression. So it uses an intersectional lens. So it doesn't talk about Black liberation over here and women's liberation over here, but it really understands that how Black women experience racism and sexism is, it's sort of like when you pour red paint and blue paint together and you get purple paint, which is now neither blue nor red. And so when you put race and gender together, the experience is of the two together now and not just one or the other. It draws from Black women's writings. And so Black women's stories, their literature, memoirs, poetry become really important as texts that are in dialogue with the biblical story. And it talks back to the text. It names the places where the text itself has been oppressive to Black women or played a role in Black women's oppression. And then it privileges the experiences, voices, and traditions of Black women. And so it is very intentional in its saying that this is the specific lens by which we're going to interpret this text. We know there are others, but this is the one we're going to do because this is the one that is going to lead to Black women's liberation. It exposes the power dynamics that maintain hierarchy, dominance, and oppression. So again, it's not simply an individual spiritual reading of the text, but rather it's a text that is geared toward social transformation. And so it explores the political and social investments of the text in ordering social relations. Now, what that means is it asks, what investment did the writers have in writing about gender and race and ethnicity in the ways that they did? What did they get out of it? And how do we examine that? And then how do we see how contemporary interpreters get something out of reading the text around gender and race and ethnicity in these particular ways? And then it looks at how the biblical text has been used to mistreat and harm and dehumanize people of African descent, and especially women of African descent. And then in particular within that, their sexual exploitation, because that's one of the features of that intersection of race and gender, is that Black women are specifically sexually exploited as part of the intersection of racism and sexism. So to practice this, we're going to do a womanist reading of Hagar. So I'm afraid you might have gotten your reading assignment a little late, and I apologize for that. But make sure you've grabbed a Bible and take a look at those passages, which is, I don't have that in front of me because I have this up. What is it? Genesis 16 and 21, I think. And we're going to put these questions in the chat. So Kathy, if you want to do that, we can put the questions in the chat. And we're going to put you into small groups, and you're going to have 15 minutes because I want you to dig in. And I've got a series of questions that'll help you see how doing a womanist reading of Hagar might work. And so you'll look for those themes we just talked about, and hopefully these questions will lead you there. And then after 15 minutes, we'll come back to the large group and we'll have a few minutes to debrief. So Kathy, if you want to put the chat questions up and put them in their small groups, we're ready to go with a womanist reading of Hagar. Okay, so we're going to move on now. And let me share my screen again. And all right, so just very quickly, post-colonial interpretation, feminist interpretation, is the way concerned with the ways that power, gender, and colonial concerns are deployed in the text. And so what that really means is that it's looking at ways some people go and take other people's lands and resources. And often what is taken in that is women, and particularly women's sexuality. And so we're reading these texts to look at how have colonizers done their work of taking land and resources and people. And then we talk about it as looking at the contact zone, where the colonizers and the colonized come into contact. And in particular, we look at how gender works at that point of contact, because again, it's different depending on whether the contact is men or women. And these set up these situations of conflict and inequality. And we can think about so much of the world that was colonized by Europeans and the ways that resources flowed out of countries in Africa and in Latin America and then back into European countries, are the ways that the resources and land of indigenous people in the US flowed into the hands of the people who took the land. And so we want to look at our interpretations for the ways that they are also entangled with notions of empire. And, I probably don't have to do a lot more than point you to the news to see this, because where we are with white Christian nationalism at this moment is a shining example of people who are interpreting the scripture from the perspective of empire, that somehow white Christians have a greater right to this land and this nation and its resources than do other people. And so we have our own set of colonial entanglements, and we see how that gets interpreted in the preaching of the Bible as a tool to maintain white Christian power in the United States. So we have a good example, well, a good awful example right in front of us. So to sort of do some post-colonial work, we're going to reread the story of Rahab. Now, I imagine you've heard it told one way, but we're going to go into our small groups now. So I'm going to stop sharing and ask Kathy to put the questions up in chat and put you back in your groups. And so you're going to look at so that whole story of Jericho from a different perspective. So looking at the story of Jericho from the perspective of those who are colonized, particularly Rahab, and the ways in which Rahab is both part of colonization and being colonized. So I'll leave it at that. So Kathy, you want to give us the questions in chat and then put folks in the group. And we're doing random groups, so you won't be back with the same people, but we'll have again about 10, 12 minutes, and then we'll come back and debrief a little bit. So Kathy, do your magic, put them in groups.